Top of the hour. Let's get started. Welcome everyone to Tech Talk Tuesday, Season 2, Episode 31. And if you are joining us for the first time, you can catch all the previous Season 1 and all of the other 30 episodes of Season 2 on YouTube. The channel is Baseline Web Training. That's all one word on YouTube. And all the other helpful how-to videos that Dan has been producing over the last year, 18 months to 2 years. There's lots of stuff there. You can learn almost just about everything that you'd call support for. You can now just call YouTube for. So check that out. And the topic for today is firmware and software and how they relate to each other, how often we update them, reasons we update them, what you might be seeing, what might actually benefit you, and the differences in what we have going on. So before we get started, I want to introduce a new face who's been on a few times. And so some of you guys might know Bob. Bob Beers is our product manager. So when new product ideas come to someone at Baseline, they get funneled to Bob, and then Bob puts them in something called the parking lot, which is just the parking lot of all the ideas that come in. And then he works with the team to sort through them and then bring them to fruition. So welcome, Bob. And then we have Dan Conger, our training manager. So I think that's going to get us started. Why don't you take it from here, Dan?
Okay, cool. Yeah, we wanted to really get an opportunity to talk specifically about firmware, but then the software that's a component of that. And if you really want to annoy one of our engineers, call our firmware, say the software on the controller. They're like, no, that is, and there's a very specific difference between firmware and software. And since I started on that, let's explain that for a second, right? So firmware, software, and I'll take a stab at it. Bob, you correct me if I'm too far off track. Firmware is code or something that's specific to a device. So my toaster may have firmware in it. My controller has firmware, and it will only run on that. Where software can do multiple different things. So I have a video editing software, and I can do video, I can do audio, I can do still images, I can do multiple things with it. But firmware only does one thing, and it's kind of hardwired, if you will, into that piece of equipment. Is that close?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to kind of distinguish it. Firmware being the logic within a hardware device to provide some kind of functionality or output. And then software could be, so technically firmware is a type of software, but then software in a larger umbrella, typically is associated with more user interface type things. So we usually think about base manager as software updates and upgrades. And then the controller hardware, utilizes firmware to provide different functions or different outputs. And it's a way to just kind of help keep those things separate when we're talking about product updates, development, or different requirements that we have. But I think you described it perfectly. It's a good analogy.
Cool. Well,
and I had a recent at my house. I ride a bike trainer that's made by a company called Wahoo. It's called a kicker bike, and it connects to kind of virtual reality software. And the shifters stopped working. So what did support say? Oh, can you please update the firmware on the bike? So the same concept is in devices all around the world.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and with Baseline technology, we've really embraced the wireless, the IoT, and edge device infrastructure with our overall system and technologies. And you see that across the board, across all of those Internet of Things, those IoT devices and edge devices like Andy's bike, your mobile devices, laptops, TVs that are all connected. You're going to see things like firmware updates and update your firmware. And we need to update this device to the most up-to-date version that we have available to take advantage of the most recent optimizations and or feature upgrades or enhancements.
So you're starting to key in on something that I wanted to pick apart too, is when you think about innovations and adaptations that Baseline is really that I think that we're really well known for, and that is important to our business. A lot of times people think of just hardware. It's like, okay, well, what's relatively new and what's innovative? Well, the precip sensor or pressure transducer, the pressure sensor, that's new technology and that's hardware. But let's talk about the firmware in there. And so let's start off with, what is our current controller firmware on a Basestation 3200? What version is that?
Yeah, it's V18.0. It's our current release to market firmware that's the most up to date.
So things are shipping out of the factory. We'll have V18.0. Okay. Now,
and if you're watching this on YouTube, today is September 14th, 2021.
Yeah.
Beautiful. That's right. Because that's gonna change. You may be watching this a year from when we recorded it. So okay. So let's kind of talk about the firmware version. There's version 18 and what there was version 17 before that, and then 16.6, and then 12.34, and after that, I don't know what was before that. But so version 12.34 is our current legacy version of firmware. Is that accurate?
Yep. Yeah, it's kind of a line we drew in the sand when we transitioned from a specific hydraulic management structure with the V12 version. We updated that and changed how the 3200 manages a hydraulic structure as it pairs with a flow station, and being able to expand the flow management capabilities at a site utilizing the abilities of a flow station. And so that implementation came with V16. And so we changed some of the features and functionalities of hydraulic management in V16. Mm-hmm. And then we had a few different optimizations from 16 to 16.1. And then we really kind of stopped at 16.6. And the reason for that was the implementation of an all new security protocol that changed how the 3200 communicates with our server, as well as with some of our, what we call our performance components, the controller extensions, that being the substation and the flow station. In a networked environment, it's important for us, like Dan had mentioned with the word adapting, and that we're adapting our technology to ensure that our security is as airtight as possible. And so V17 was us implementing new security protocols and file transfer protocols to ensure that how the 3200 is communicating to the server and to other devices is as airtight as possible. And so V17 was that upgrade. And the reason why we needed a new firmware version to go from 16 to 17 is to ensure that your substation is compatible with that 3200 and that they're able to communicate with each other. And then moving up from V17 to V18 is there's another kind of really important, there are multiple really important updates there that we can kind of speak to. But what were you thinking, Andy?
Well, I was just thinking that if you guys are listening and some of you are like, okay, it's coming in this year and it's going out this year, and that is totally normal because a lot of the updates are just under the hood. They just make things run better, connect better, communicate better, more secure, but there's really not always a user interface benefit. So some updates you don't really have to know about. You don't have to remember it's 18 dot this or it's 16 dot that or 17 this or that. It's like too much information. So just keep that in mind. Not every single firmware or software update matters to you as the user, but they're still happening and occurring so that we can improve the system.
Yeah. Like that communication thing that you mentioned, that if you weren't having a communication issue with your devices and your controller, you won't ever notice that step in that firmware.
Exactly. And yeah, to Andy's point and kind of what we've been discussing that Dan had brought up, it's adapting things. And a lot of our adapting updates are kind of under the hood. So a lot of optimizations that are under the hood and ensuring that our systems are performing to the best of their ability in whatever environment that they're operating in. And so with one of our upcoming updates, which will be 18.1, it's really built around cellular communication and ensuring that as we move from 3G to 4G, 4G to 5G, and as those different cellular infrastructures change and the technologies that are being used by service providers like AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile, et cetera, those change over time too. And we need to make sure that our devices are optimized in those different environments as things around us change. And so with 18.1, it's really ensuring that the entire baseline product family is optimized in a 5G environment. And so we're already shipping and utilizing hardware that can comprehend a 5G service and 4G LTE, but then we need to have the overall system updated to ensure that we're optimized in that scenario.
So here's an analogy. I think this is kind of similar to Andy's situation. It's possible then that my controller, I don't need any of those other features and it's doing exactly what I want it to do. But the cellular technologies that baseline doesn't control start changing and changing and changing. And then it doesn't, at some point, it just doesn't work the way I want it to. Andy's shifters didn't work because his shifters didn't change. something else changed, perhaps in the networking or something else outside of the realm of his bike. So is that pretty accurate?
Yeah, definitely. And we kind of touched on that before. It's like, hey, I'm not seeing any issues at all. I'm communicating just fine. I just kind of want to stay where I am. But that's not going to be likely an indefinite scenario. There's going to come a point in time where communication, whether it's Wi-Fi, Ethernet, or any kind of communication protocol, is not going to work to the most optimal extent that it can. And that's just true of any networked IoT technology that we see across any wireless devices, Andy's bike, your cell phone, your car, etc. And it's just as things age and things change over time, we can keep the same hardware platform and then just simply update the firmware to ensure that those optimizations that we've developed are then implemented for your device and then bring you back up to the best performance possible.
Okay. So then let's kind of come to this. So I don't think we really need to get into what's in version 18 and what's in the version 17. I don't think that's so critical, although we've got a really good explanation on the website. And if we have time, I'll show that a little later on. But why might somebody want to change firmware versions? Why might someone want to go from 17 to 18, or heck, even 12 to 16 or 12 to 18? Why might ever want to change that?
Yeah, and it could be very specific to the user or to the site or to the needs and the outcomes that they're looking to achieve at their site. But some of the changes that you could look at for, say, a customer who currently has V17 and they want to go to V18, one big change with V18 is how the controller is communicating to the server and how it's communicating along with additional substations if your site has substations or flow stations. So we put a lot of those optimizations as we've seen a lot of market success with the substation and how that has changed a lot of the dynamics at a site and how users interact with the controller. Because you can think about an environment or a site where you used to have 5 independent controllers and a user could be logged into each one independently. But now with the 3200 and our wireless 2-wire technology that we've implemented and executed for a few years, you have 1 controller and 4 substations. So now all 5 users are logged into that 1 controller simultaneously. That's a pretty fundamental difference in how a user interacts with the device. And so what V18 is how we comprehended that and optimized the customer experience, because it's very different from 1 user logging into 1 controller versus 5 users logging into 1 controller. So how do we ensure that statuses are all accurate across all 5 users, and how that information then getting passed back and forth from the controller to the server is optimized, as well as getting all that information from the substations and making sure everything matches up really well. So what's a really important update with V18 is if you have substations or flow stations, is that we put a lot of work into optimizing those sites and how multiple users can interact with a single controller.
Yeah, that's a fundamental change in the user behavior with a controller. And there's going to be a difference between 5 people using a single controller at the same time and 10 people using this controller at the same time. And 5 years ago, really only 1 person was ever logged in at the same time for the most part.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And so seeing the success with the substation, seeing that grow in market, seeing that be adopted more and more places, we really need to make sure that we were optimizing the customer experience. And so if you're on V17 and you don't think you're seeing any issues, that's great. But just know that V18 has some optimizations around substation communication and flow station communication. And then additionally, and then you might be going there, Dan, is while the controller is optimized and the communication to a substation is optimized and flow station, another reason why you'd want to go up to V18 has nothing to do with the controller itself. It has to do with Base Manager and App Manager, because there are features that we're able to move forward and that we're able to bring to market that really help improve the customer experience. But we can't always develop features in Base Manager and App Manager and have them be compatible all the way back to V12 and V16 and V17. And again, this is true with product development across any wireless infrastructure, any devices, is at some point you got to say, I'm compatible with V18, and then you move the product forward. And so our new feature sets that we're going to be releasing with Base Manager versions, say 4.31 or 4.32, are really looking at V18 and higher. And so if you're on version 17 and your system's working great, which is what we'd expect, and that's what we're happy with, you still might want to upgrade to V18 so then you can get all the benefits of these new features that we're releasing in Base Manager.
So you cross that line, you kind of seamlessly cross that line from firmware into software web services, right? I can see why that would be confusing. It's kind of a blurry line, but if I got this right, and this is what we talked about before the show, was there are some features when we upgrade Base Manager, which is, as Andy succinctly puts it, it's under the hood. You don't even know when we do our server roll. The only reason we know is because we know about internal testing, but most users won't know when there's a Base Manager change. But it's possible that we could do a Base Manager change, and if I'm on older firmware, I won't see those changes.
Yep, exactly.
And you described that process so when I log into Base Manager, that process was Base Manager is going to query my particular controller.
Yep.
And then,
yeah. So just like that. So like you're saying, you're logged in and the server knows who you are and what controllers you have access to. And when you log in, the controller is going to reach out to the database and or directly to the controller and get its latest configuration files. In that configuration file is the firmware version for that controller. And that firmware version then informs Base Manager what to show you the user when you're logged in. And so that software is looking at the firmware, just not to make it overly complicated, so that it knows what features to show you and how to let you interact with the controller. And the reason why that's important really isn't about V16, 17, or 18, but it's the difference between a 3200 and a 1000, or a 3200 and a substation. And so how does the server know what to display to the user when you're interacting with that controller in Base Manager or an App Manager? And it's the firmware version. So it
tells you like how educated it is. You can't talk to it in a language above its education level. It has to be, at the same level.
Right.
Yep.
So I wanted to balance back up to firmware for a minute, because I just realized there's two things that we should probably cover before we move on. One is you said Substation and Flow Station and 1000. Those all have individual firmwares. We're talking V18 is referring to the 3200, Basestation 3200 firmware. But what's the current firmware on the Basestation 1000?
It's 1.26.
Okay.
And the Substation is 2.3, and the Flow Station is 3.5.
So there are versions. So if I had a different version of firmware on my Substation, it may not have good communication, or the interface between that and the 3200 may not work right. So it may not be optimized right. So having the right firmware version for each of those is important.
Absolutely. Yep.
Okay.
And
that's good.
And as we update firmware, we're always looking at that whole product family environment to ensure that all devices are communicating and that communication is optimized.
Okay. So coming back to the software on Base Manager, we've got different versions of Base Manager out there. And how do I know what version of Base Manager I'm looking at when I log in? I like Andy's smile because he knows what the answer is. Like, does it matter? No.
Yeah, it doesn't really matter. We put the versions in there just so you can see what changed. So it's more of a change history versus what version of Base Manager. Because once you're logged in, you can't change the version of Base Manager.
Right. I was just going to say that all users have the same version, because the version is not specific to the login. It's not like a CD that you put in your computer and you load an application and everybody could be different. That's the value of cloud-based service, is everyone is always on whatever we have put out there, new or rolled back. It doesn't matter. It's always what baseline has.
Right. And I think that's one of the cool things too about a cloud-based or server and Base Manager and App Manager is that, we'll do a server update over the weekend, and then when you log in Monday, you can have a completely different interface. And I've kind of likened it to the Google Doodle. If you go to google.com and you might have a cute little search animation that pops up on Valentine's Day, and a different one on 4th of July, and a different one on whatever day of the week, and they just change it every day. And we could change ours however often we want.
Good idea, Dan. Bob, will you put that in the parking lot?
Yep.
I want one for my birthday.
No, we could do that. Yeah, ideally, we like to kind of move into a regular release cadence that we call it. And so each release is broken into a number of sprints, and sprints is how much time it takes engineering to complete a specific chunk of work. Usually it's like 2 weeks. And then we have some testing in there. And so we usually try to get about a 4 to 5 week release cycle that we're then able to release, any type of feature optimization or introduce a new feature or have any kind of under the hood update too. So you may have noticed from May to June to July and August, we've had some consistent updates to release new features and new optimizations to market.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you if you were willing to share, but you did just share what our current release cycle is. And then what was it? I don't think it was always that high of a frequency. It used to be like yearly, quarterly, things like that.
Yeah, it's changed a little bit over time. And some of it is related to our development team and just what we're working on at that point in time. We're coming up very soon to a release that we're going to expand out the timing of the release, which is our version 4.32 for Base Manager. Again, doesn't really matter what the version number is on your end, but it's a big update that's under the hood, and it's going to take longer than one release cycle to be able to implement it. And so it'll probably be about 2 months to closer to 3 months in between releases. And that's to ensure we have proper testing and that everything is thoroughly vetted before it's released, because it's a big structural change under the hood. And then there's also a really cool feature in there that I can kind of tease for program runtime calculator that will also be released at that time. But
neat.
Yeah, previously, it could have been a year, it could be 6 months. And we've really tried to groom in a consistent release cycle that's about every 5 weeks, and that we've been hitting on pretty well for the spring and summer of 2021. And that's really what our objective is moving forward. So smaller releases. And for those of you who are familiar with product development, we talk about it in terms of agile product development. So we can release something and then iterate and change it over time to ensure that it meets really the market need and market demand. And that we're always moving things forward to either innovate or adapt based off of what we're looking at.
I'm remembering last year I got one of the test versions of a firmware for my office, my demo controller, and I remember poking through it and finding all the nooks and crannies, and found there was a space for hardware that I didn't have yet. So would you talk about that interconnectivity between hardware, new hardware, or hardware that you want to develop, the firmware, and then Base Manager software, because there's places those all fit together in some way.
Yeah, it's a full system. So think about the device in the field that's connected either physically or communicating wirelessly via substation to a single 3200. And then the 3200 is talking to a server and to a database. And then that server is connected to our Base Manager API, and that's software. So we're able to expose this information in Base Manager and App Manager. And so when we're looking at new hardware, so a new device like a pressure sensor or a precip sensor, we've got to really think through that entire model, that entire scope of the product, because the product isn't just one thing, it's that full system. It's the device in the ground talking to a controller talking to the server. And at each phase, we have to make decisions about what we're going to implement, how that product's going to behave, and what we show the user to ensure that we're doing exactly what we want. And we might release it in phases. We might have a phase 1 where it could just be at the controller only. And then phase 2, we then expose it into Base Manager and App Manager. And even there could be future releases to where we do more with the data and show the user different data points at different places in the UI. And so that full system has to be comprehended. When we release the precip sensor, technically the precip sensor works with 17.16, 17.15, but only in the controller. You can't see that in Base Manager. So if you have a controller, a Basestation 3200 with version 17.15, you might be able to plug in a base station or a baseline precip sensor, and it could work, but it won't be visible in Base Manager. And so that's one of the reasons why, as we move firmware forward, you can go up to version 18 and have a precip sensor, and then it will show up in Base Manager.
Right. Yeah.
And that's some of that compatibility changes and how we roll products through and devices through. And that's true even of your decoders. What's impressive and what's interesting with our technology is, our baseline decoders are essentially small computers that are out in the field that's working as an overall networked system. It's not just flipping and opening and closing a master valve or opening and closing a solenoid or energizing a solenoid, right? It's actually capturing information, storing it, and then communicating back to the 3200 or its 1000 or substation, all of that information and storing it there. And so as we change and introduce new devices, we also have to update the decoder that's attached to it or interfaced with it so it can comprehend what type of input that it's getting, whether it's a flow sensor or a pressure sensor or a moisture sensor, or et cetera. And so I think one little tidbit that's really cool with Baseline is our flow sensor can read pulses at extremely fast rates, 200 times a second or 200 times a minute. But it can also go really, really, really slow. And we can read a pulse up to 18 minutes apart and still capture that correctly and act on it. So hundreds of times a minute, and then all the way down to 18 minutes apart. And that's the flexibility of Baseline technology at the decoder level that then we can comprehend at the controller level and then expose it up in the user interface.
So what you're saying, I just want to try to clarify, the decoder is taking those pulse readings on its own. The controller is not calling it, saying, take a reading. The decoder is doing it, then sending it back, and you can change, regulate that ability right in the decoder level.
Exactly.
Awesome.
And that's just one of the big differentiators for a Baseline decoder versus other decoders that are in market.
Could be a topic for another episode because that is definitely tech worthy and we need to talk more about it. I do think maybe we should open up for some questions. We got about 4 minutes left. And so if you have any questions, hit us in the chat or the Q&A. We did have one question about V18. It could be support related, but I think I'll just ask you, Bob, in case you have anything to say about it. Could moving to 18.0 cause buttons on a 3200 to be a little bit sticky?
Nope. Yeah, that wouldn't be firmware related. So if it's the physical experience of pushing a button and the button itself is sticking, no, that would not be firmware related.
Yep. And I have to be careful about not answering a question that hasn't been asked. But from my experience, sometimes slow behavior on a controller could mean that it's filling up. If it's been out there in the field a long time and it's had a lot of connected devices, it could be sort of filling up and just starting to act slow. But that may be completely not what you're experiencing also. So the best thing to do would be to get a hold of support.
Yep. Yeah, agreed.
Okay. Excellent. Well, if you're waiting for questions to fill in, I can show real quickly where to find the firmware on there on the updated website.
Yeah. And while you're doing that, Dan, it's probably just a good idea if you're adding a new device to a controller, go ahead and update the firmware. Because knowing the version of it may or may not matter. But if you're adding a precip sensor, you're doing something new and you have that time and that moment to do it, it could be just a good idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
So from our previous webinar, we realized that baselinesystems.com now redirects to hydropoint.com/baseline. But you can get to this from resources and you could go to support, or you could go right to firmware updates. And on the firmware update section, we're going to have all the information. So we're talking why Bob and I didn't get into what's different about each version. Well, here we say what's important about each version, right? So here's 1234. If you needed to roll backwards.
While you're showing that, Dan, let me ask you something, Bob. 1234. Approximately what year was that? What was the date on that release?
Ooh, wow.
I'm going to guess 2013.
For 1234?
Yeah.
It was actually later than that. Okay. I remember in part because it's right around when I started with Baseline.
Yeah.
And HydroPoint, it was around March, April of 2017 was when 3.4 came out. But V12 came out, version 12, around 2012.
Okay. And I guess what I wanted to say was that even a controller with 12.3.4 still communicates with Base Manager. You can still use it as you could at the time you purchased the controller, but it may not be compatible with some of the newer stuff, but you can still use it as you purchased it.
Yep.
So here we've got some great, here's all the different, the substation, the flow station, all the different versions. And then there's a README that talks about the process of how to do this. But in many times, I think that the way Bob described this is if something isn't working the way I expected, it's not optimized, it's probably going to be driven by support. They might say, like your bike, Andy, I think you want to update to the latest firmware to rule that portion of the problem out.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, let's see. What do we have scheduled for next week, Dan?
Next week, Agile Bone's going to be on a lightning prone site, and we're going to talk about grounding and kind of mitigating some of those lightning issues. And then that'll lead to another episode on 3-point grounding. Awesome.
Well, lightning definitely is a factor. 3-point grounding is very important. So please, our request to you would be, tell a colleague, share Tech Talk Tuesday with somebody that have them registered, join us. We'd like to share what we have with more people and help more people. So if you wouldn't mind doing that, we would really appreciate it. And otherwise, try something new with Baseline. Use a different feature, push a different button, program something differently, something new, see what happens, and let us know how it went.
Great call.
So I think with that, guys, we'll see you next week.
Okay. Have a great week,
everybody.
everybody. Take care.
Bye-bye.